Once again, welcome. We are so pleased that you have joined us for this talk this evening. This is a talk in our Mid-Coast Audubon series, and tonight we are going to be learning about the new book, Birds of Maine. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to our representative here this evening from the Mid-Coast Audubon, Kit Pfeiffer. Kit?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Hi, I am Kit Pfeiffer, a member of Mid-Coast Audubon, and we're just delighted with your record numbers tuning in tonight. And I can assure you, you have a fascinating hour ahead. Very briefly, let me introduce you to Mid-Coast Audubon if you're not familiar with who we are and what we do. We are an all-volunteer organization. We hold these monthly programs in the winter free of charge. We love our partnership with Camden Public Library. We offer free birding trips when we're allowed to be together again. We hope that is soon. We also steward several local preserves. We provide scholarships to individuals to attend natural history programs. We provide free birding stations, winter birding stations, to schools and libraries in Mid-Coast Maine. And in fact, the application deadline is coming up on March 30th if you want to get your library or school involved. So check our website. And all of this is made possible, thank you, with your membership dues. If you're not a member, that's easy. Get on our website and join up. So now it's my deep pleasure to introduce two very special presenters tonight, Barbara Vickery and Scott Weidensaul, who are the managing editors of this recently published book, Birds of Maine by Peter Vickery. Barbara had a distinguished 33-year career as Director of Conservation Programs at the Maine chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and she remains an active board member of several important Maine conservation organizations. Scott is an ornithologist, author, and field researcher specializing in bird migration of, among other birds, our rock stars in Maine this winter, the snowy owls. He's a longtime friend of Mid-Coast Audubon and teaches popular courses at Hog Island Audubon Camp in Bremen. We thank you both. And Scott, I think you are up first.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kit. Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to see everybody this evening, and pleasure to see some old friends among the tiny little boxes that we're all looking at right now, this brave new Zoom world that we all inhabit. Barbara and I are really delighted to be with you this evening and to tell you a little bit more about this book that's been kind of a labor of love for a number of us for quite a few years. And I'm going to be operating the slideshow on this end, although actually Barbara's going to kind of lead us off. So we're going to both turn off our video cameras while the slides are going, both to preserve bandwidth and because you won't be able to see Barbara when I'm screen sharing anyway. It's just, we haven't figured out everything about Zoom. So bear with me for just a moment while we do the inevitable fumbling around here of screen sharing. And if the gods are the technology gods are working properly, you should be looking at the cover of the book of the Birds of Maine. Can somebody give me?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, terrific. Barbara, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Scott. It's really exciting to be here. I wish I could see all your faces in person. I scanned the chat line and I didn't actually recognize that many names, but I thought if I were in person, I would have lots of people coming up to me and saying, I knew Peter, and then I would start to cry. But we're not doing that, so I won't cry. So Birds of Maine is what we're talking about tonight. It represents a decades-long effort by Peter to create the first comprehensive work on Maine birds in more than 70 years. It also represents a labor of love on behalf of a large team of editors, co-authors, artists, cartographers, and designers to bring Peter's vision to fruition following his death in 2017. Peter was a passionate birder. Studying birds was his avocation as well as vocation. When Peter moved to Maine in the 1970s and began exploring to see every bird and get every birding experience he could here on the Bluenose Ferry to Nova Scotia, his Bible was Ralph Palmer's deeply researched book, Maine Birds. He was thrilled to meet Palmer, Ralph was a bit of a curmudgeon, but astonishingly knowledgeable about a wide array of natural history topics, and Peter was full of curiosity. So they soon became friends and correspondents. But he also soon found that however authoritative, Palmer's book, published in 1949, was outdated, and Peter began gathering material for an update. He started with a annotated checklist he published in 1978 with Maine Audubon. Already, that checklist included 30 species that had not been in Palmer's Maine birds. In addition to his own extensive fieldwork, Peter gathered volumes of old records, hunted down long out of print journals and articles. I believe he collected the most complete sets of every one of the dozen Maine bird journals that appeared between 1900 and 2000 of any library in Maine. He also corresponded with scores of birders across the state, all with the goal of creating a comprehensive update for Palmer's original book. When Peter got his diagnosis of terminal cancer in 2015, he had compiled the pertinent data for nearly all of Maine's 464 species, and he had written 350 species accounts. But he wasn't done. A kind doctor advised him to assemble a team to take the book over the finish line. Peter had already recruited Bill Sheehan, on the left here, who lives in northern Aroostook County, to draft waterfall accounts and provide a northern Maine perspective. He had asked Jeff Wells, who had been his field assistant on the Kennebunk Plains when he was doing research there, to complete the warbler accounts. And Jeff was the right person, because Jeff in the meantime had gone on to specialize in boreal bird conservation, so he knew a lot about the warblers. He asked Charles Duncan, with whom he had taught seabird workshops at UMaine Machias and who had become head of Manomet's Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, to write the seabird accounts and update Peter's shorebird accounts, many of which Peter had first drafted a decade earlier. Peter asked his friend Scott, with whom he had taught ornithology at Hog Island, to be the team captain and chief editor. Peter also reconnected with his old friend Lars Johnson, world-renowned Swedish bird artist. Lars made 3 trips to Maine to prepare studies for the book's paintings. Barry Van Dusen, a colleague while Peter worked at Mass Audubon, generously agreed that Peter could use any of his previously published ink drawings without charge, and he did dozens of additional new drawings for the book on commission. So this was the core team that was needed to complete Peter's work. And now Scott's going to tell you a bit more about what's actually in the book.
Thanks, Barbara. And as you saw with that photograph of Lars Johnson, not only is Lars one of the world's most renowned bird painters, he's also a giant Viking. I'm shocked every time I see a picture of Lars. So the result of all of this was The Birds of Maine, which was published in November of last year. 642 roughly 10-pound doorstop of a book that is an astounding testament to Peter, who, as Barbara said, had completed about 3/4 of the 464 species accounts that cover every species of bird ever recorded in the state, including extinct species like the great auk and the passenger pigeon and the Labrador duck. It was my privilege to serve as the co-managing editor with Barbara, who was the one who kept us on task and on schedule and under budget over the course of the roughly 5 years or so that it took us to complete this book. And speaking of finances, the book was underwritten with donations from hundreds of private donors, a significant gift from the Nuttall Ornithological Club in Cambridge, which has served as co-publisher with Princeton University Press, and partnerships with Maine Audubon and the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund. So why Maine? I think for anybody who birds in Maine, you know that this is Maine is an amazingly diverse state, surprisingly so. It's the largest and most northerly state in New England with depending on how you measure it, between 2,000 and 5,000 miles of coastline, thousands of islands in the Gulf of Maine, habitats that range from oak forest to boreal bogs to spruce forests to blueberry barrens down east. And so because of that diversity, Maine packs a remarkable variety of birds into its 35,000 square miles or so. In southern Maine, you have species like nesting snowy egrets that we normally would associate with southern wetlands, and then northern boreal species like boreal chickadees and blackback woodpeckers and Canada jays. which I'm still learning to say Canada jays rather than gray jays. Maine's the only US state, of course, with nesting Atlantic puffins, thanks to groundbreaking conservation work over the last 40 years that pioneered critical seabird conservation techniques that are now used all around the world. And the Gulf of Maine as a whole is really rich in breeding and migrant seabirds. So the book starts with some really extensive introductory chapters that were written by the editors and the co-authors, along with a number of outside experts. That cover a lot of ground, exploring why Maine has the birds it has, how human history has shaped the state's avifauna and is continuing to shape the state's avifauna. We look at the state's birds through the lens of Maine's topography, its climate, its landforms, how complex ocean currents in the Gulf of Maine exert a really profound influence on the mainland, including those dense spruce forests that thrive on the down east coast thanks to persistent cool temperatures and perennial fog. The bird life of any particular region is molded by the climate and the landforms there. And we take a look at Maine's ornithological history from the time of European settlement up through the present, including such notable figures as Theodore Roosevelt, not somebody who's generally associated with Maine, but a lot of his conservation ethos that he brought to his presidency was formed at least partly here in Maine, and some lifelong friendships with folks in Maine, and pioneering female ornithologists, especially Cordelia Stanwood. We also look at the importance of Maine's natural history societies, its many bird clubs, and especially its bird camps like Chewonki and Hog Island on the mid-coast. We also take a really deep and highly detailed dive into the conservation needs of Maine's birds. What species are thriving, which ones aren't, why, and more importantly, what actions are needed now in the face of rising human populations and rising climate change to safeguard those bird populations for the future. And we'll have a little bit more about that in a minute. It was Peter's goal, it was our goal from the beginning to produce a book that was as aesthetically pleasing and attractive as it was ornithologically rich. And I think we've really accomplished that. Part of that is due to the maps. Cartographer Bill Hancock created hundreds of maps for the book, including end papers that show the full Maine coast and all the seabird breeding islands, highly detailed regional maps showing all the state's important bird locations, range maps for every single species of bird that reaches any kind of a range limit in the state. And many of those maps actually, in addition to showing current range, show how abundance and distribution has changed over time. We were really delighted that Peter's old friend Lars Johnson agreed early on to create a series of watercolors for the book. And when I say he is a giant Viking, you can see there, I am not kidding. As Barbara mentioned, Lars made 3 long research trips to Maine over the course of the project in order to observe and paint some of our iconic species like Bicknell's thrush in high elevation spruce forests, olive-sided flycatchers in some of Maine's extensive bog wetlands, and the one that I would commit larceny in order to possess, which is his painting of snowy owls up in the farmlands of Aroostook County up in northern Maine. Having somebody of Lars's stature as involved with this book meant a great deal to Peter, meant a great deal to all of us. We were also extremely lucky to have Barry Van Dusen provide hundreds of his existing ink and pencil drawings, and then also create dozens of commission drawings. We had long conversations among the Birds of Maine team as to exactly what species we wanted illustrated and where, and we had some, I won't say knockdown drag-out fights, but we had some long discussions, heated discussions, because we, frankly, we wanted Lars and Barry to illustrate every single species, but we couldn't do that. The majority of the book is made up of extensive species accounts, each of which details each of the birds' status in Maine, both today and historically, and provides notes on the conservation condition, conservation status of each of those species. But the meat of each of these accounts lies in highly detailed seasonal sections that cover migration timing and breeding and high counts and late dates and rarity records, this incredibly complete summary of pretty much everything that we know about that species in Maine. In many cases, the accounts are accompanied by migration maps based on the latest tracking data showing where Maine's birds go at other times of the year. And this is actually something that, so far as we know, no other state bird book has ever done. This attempt to show, you know, like for example, whimbrels. I mean, whimbrels don't nest in Maine. They don't winter in Maine. They're only here during migration. But by showing the migration tracks of these birds coming from the Northwest Territories and heading down to the Caribbean and South America, you know, these migration maps stitch Maine's birds into the tapestry of global migration. I just want to make clear, though, because there have been some comments on Amazon. Apparently, people have been surprised when they've gotten the book that it is not an identification guide. This book weighs 10 pounds. You are not going to want to carry this book in the field. This is very much a reference book for you to read at home and learn more about the birds of Maine that way. And yes, it does include what is without doubt the most exceptional Maine bird record of all. The great black hawk that appeared in 2018, a very long way from its home in the Central American tropics, to the utter astonishment of pretty much everyone. And I'd say, you know, the second most dramatic and unusual bird record in there was the Vermilion Flycatcher that showed up on the osprey nest at Hog Island in April when there was nobody on the island, but a woman watching the osprey cam from her desk in Germany thought, that's an odd bird, and took a screenshot and got a record of only the second Vermilion Flycatcher to show up in the state of Maine. So, you know, bird records in Maine, like elsewhere, have really come into the digital age. And so at this point, I'm going to turn things back over to Barbara, and she's going to dig into some of the trends and discoveries and surprises that we came up with while we were working on this book. Barbara?
Thank you, Scott. First, I want to say this photo and some others that will appear in this next section were shared with us by Doug Hitchcock of Maine Audubon. I see you all are going to be having, or at least the library in Midcoast will be having Doug Hitchcock's program later on. He takes wonderful photographs, so we're grateful for that. So Birds of Maine also provides a window on how Maine's avifauna has changed over the past 70 years since the publication of Maine's Palmer's Maine Birds. Some species have done extraordinarily well.
Running into a little problem getting, all of a sudden it's not advancing.
Sure.
There we go.
There you go. Canada geese, for instance, were extirpated as a nesting species in Maine in the 1800s, but after some pairs were released in the 1960s, they became so successful they now breed on even the most remote offshore islands, increasing 46,000% since 1960. But wild turkeys have done even better. Since their reintroduction to the state in the 70s, they have exploded in range and abundance, increasing 810,000% in that time. By contrast, bank swallows, which were once common summer residents throughout the state, have declined so badly that today only 0.2% of their 1966 population remains in Maine, mostly in southern counties. Looking at the big picture, a couple of points are clear. Many of the species that are doing very well have benefited from concerted action. Introduction programs for species like turkeys and puffins, focused protection efforts like piping plover wardens, or banning especially pernicious pesticides like DDT. Among the groups of birds in the biggest trouble in Maine are those that depend on specialized and increasingly threatened habitats like grasslands, shrublands, wetlands, although these may also hold the greatest chance for quick returns if we can focus conservation action on protecting, restoring, and managing those habitats appropriately. Less easily tackled is the plight of aerial insectivores like swifts, swallows, and nightjars, some of which have experienced the steepest declines of all of Maine's hundreds of species. The so-called insect apocalypse, the global collapse of insect populations, echoed in Maine from climate change, pesticide use, and landscape alterations, likely lies at the root of this problem. Maine is 90% forest, the most heavily wooded state in the US. So it's not surprising that large proportions of global populations of a number of species of neotropical migrants that depend on forests, many of them in decline, nest in Maine, and giving the state a significant role in stewardship responsibility for their conservation. And by the way, if it seems odd to see a Blackburnian warbler on the rocks, you need to visit Monhegan Island in spring, when you might be lucky enough to experience a warbler fallout, where you'll find the birds in between the stacked lobster traps. There have been winners and losers. Of the species that breed in Maine, 27 show significant increases based on breeding bird surveys, mostly species that are habitat generalists, year-round residents, or short distance migrants, or species like the turkeys that receive human intervention. Turkeys, titmice, and turkey vultures have enjoyed some of the strongest increases, while others like blue-headed vireo and ovenbird have seen more modest ones. Another 73 breeding species in Maine show no significant trend up or down. That said, there were 62 breeding species, in other words, more than twice the number of those increasing, that are showing significant declining trends. Some of them, like the bank swallow, truly alarming. Many of these are habitat or foraging specialists, like grassland birds or insectivorous birds, or are long-distance neotropical migrants. But even widespread species like song sparrows and American robins, some of them show small declines over time. In some cases, though, monitoring systems at different times of the year reflected different trends. So for instance, American robin, cedar waxwing, and Savannah sparrows all show small long-term declines in their breeding population, but they exhibit robust increases on Christmas bird counts, probably the result of more northern breeders wintering here instead of migrating farther south. In the case of robins, the 7% annual increase in CBC numbers over the past 50 years means that for every robin that wintered in Maine in 1966, 30 do so today. Probably if you participated in some CBCs this year, you noticed. The robins are hard to miss. Overall, Christmas bird counts have shown some remarkable increases for a number of species. The top 5 include eastern bluebirds, up 33%, wild turkeys, 32%, red-bellied woodpeckers, Bohemian waxwings, and American widgeons, now overwintering on ice-free coastal rivers and bays, up between 13 and 16%. On the losing end in winter, those species showing the steepest decline since 1966 include brown-headed cowbirds and ring-necked pheasants, along with common grackles and broiled chickadees. Interestingly, while evening grosbeaks showed a long-term decline since the 60s, since 2007, just looking at that more recent window, 2007 to 2017, perhaps because spruce budworm, an important food for their chicks, was again building in numbers across eastern Canada, they're up by 67%. So don't look now, but here they come. And some of us have even been seeing them this year. The increases for many species are almost certainly linked to a warming climate. Climate change, along with landscape modifications, have allowed many species to push north, some of them making dramatic range advances in a very short time, like northern cardinals, northern mockingbirds, and turkey vultures. Over the past 40 years, tufted titmice have slowly occupied more and more of southern Maine year-round, while red-bellied woodpeckers moved much more rapidly, and some individuals have already made it as far as Newfoundland. Turkey vultures first appeared in Maine in 1976 and have become year-round residents, especially along the coast. Black vultures, once casual here, are following the same path and have become annual since the 1990s. But intriguingly, we've also documented some dramatic range advances south by several boreal birds, including fox sparrows, whose breeding range has simultaneously moved north in northern Quebec as the boreal forest taiga boundary has moved north. They've also moved more than 250 miles south in less than 3 decades to mountains of western Maine, not only in Maine, but in neighboring states and provinces. Merlins have made the most dramatic expansion, not only in Maine, but across eastern North America, after having been decimated by DDT, as so many other raptors were. They first nested in Maine in 1986 on the Down East Island, and now they nest statewide and as far south as Maryland and West Virginia. Maine also holds a significant place in the history of seabird conservation. It is where Project Puffin began in the 1970s when Steve Kress and his colleagues from National Audubon relocated Atlantic puffin chicks from Newfoundland to Eastern Egg Rock, a century after they had been extirpated in the state. There are now restored puffin colonies on 6 islands in the Gulf of Maine, totaling nearly 1,200 pairs, a number that grows every year. Steve Kress and his colleagues pioneered what are known as social attraction techniques. Some of us sometimes feel like we need some of that in isolation right now. Using decoys, audio lures, and even mirrors to create the illusion of thriving seabird colonies, and thus attract alcids, terns, and other seabirds to reestablish lost colonies. It's an approach that's been used worldwide on dozens of threatened and endangered seabirds. And the workshop that produces those decoys for use around the world, now run by National Audubon, do you all know where it is? It's in Bremen. Pretty cool. In all, the Gulf of Maine holds 18 managed seabird islands. You'll note here that we include, way off to the right, if you can read that small font, Machias Seal Island. Although it flies a Canadian flag, despite a boundary dispute with Canada stretching back to the 18th century, both the United States and Canadian governments cooperate on seabird protection there. The past decades have also demonstrated again how complicated nature can be and how changes to a single species can have wide-ranging ripple effects. The resurgence of bald eagles in Maine from a few dozen pairs in the 1970s to nearly 800 today stands as a remarkable success story. And I think we can all cheer about that. When I moved to my house here in Richmond, Maine 40 years ago, the realtor, we saw a bald eagle. And I told the realtor and she said, I had it teed up because I knew that would make you guys buy the house. Well, that was at that point a really rare occasion. Now it's very rare for me not to see a bald eagle in a day from my house in Richmond. But that recovery's had an impact on a lot of other birds. The eagle recovery coincided with a modest recovery by great cormorants, which had once been extirpated from the state. But as eagle numbers have grown, so their predation on great cormorant nestlings has, and the cormorants are again in serious decline. Similarly, in some areas like Muscongas Bay, eagles are exerting tremendous predation pressure on nesting ospreys, many of which no longer successfully fledged chicks there. Many of them have moved inland. And eagles have caused the extirpation or relocation of a number of coastal great blue heron colonies. The plot thickens. Herring and great blackback gull populations were already in steep decline from their peak in the 1980s due to the closure of offshore fishing industry and open landfills. Eagle predation is now adding to that decline. But lower gull numbers have meant less predation on common eider chicks and the beginning of a recovery of eider numbers in some areas after a long decrease. Some changes are simply a mystery. One of the most remarkable bird events in Maine, and an enduring mystery, that took place every August on Passamaquoddy Bay on the Maine-New Brunswick border. Here, the complex topography, huge tidal range, and resulting strong currents create a gigantic whirlpool known as the Old Sow, the largest tidal whirlpool in the Western Hemisphere. The currents bring marine organisms to the surface, attracting immense numbers of migrant Bonapartes and other gulls. In those days, back in the 70s, it was the place to go to catch a rare vagrant gull. And Peter and Davis Finch would sit at the end of Deer Island for hours and hours and hours scanning through all those gulls, hoping to see something different. They often did. But through the 70s and early 80s, it also attracted up to 3 million red-necked phalaropes that staged on Passamaquoddy Bay during their fall migration. The phalaropes would sit on the surface of the water, spinning and pecking at the zooplankton that were brought to the surface by the currents. And then they would be moved by the currents down slope, so to speak, down current, and then they'd all pick up and fly up and then take the ride again. The phalaropes and Bonaparte's gulls formed one of the greatest avian spectacles in North America, and a puzzle because no one knew where the phalaropes went after leaving Passamaquoddy. But before that mystery could be solved, another and more puzzling one emerged. In a matter of a few years in the late 1980s, the number of red-necked phalaropes began to collapse from millions in the 70s to 200,000 in 1985 to 20,000 in 1987 to 20 in 1989, and essentially none thereafter. The multitudes have never recurred. The cause of the disappearance and where the phalaropes were now staging remains a mystery, although scientists believe changes in the zooplankton available at the surface lie at the root of the change. In the words of Birds of Maine co-author Charles Duncan, who documented the decline as it happened, that restaurant wasn't serving the all-you-can-eat buffet anymore, although plenty of whales, seals, and porpoises still find lots of food there. But we have at long last solved the mystery of where the red-necked phalaropes go for the winter. Scientists on the island of Shetland tagged phalaropes that nest there with geolocators and found that they pass through Gulf of Maine in autumn en route to wintering grounds off the Pacific coast of South America, where presumably the Eastern Canadian Arctic population that used to stage in Passamaquoddy Bay also winters. Literally, who knew? Such changes, for good and ill, both dramatic and subtle, will continue. That's one of the things that makes ornithology fascinating and keeps birding interesting. Those of us on the Birds of Maine team take a great deal of satisfaction knowing that by helping to bring Peter's work to life, we've not only informed this generation, pointed the way to vital research and conservation needs, but also laid down a baseline that will be important for generations to come as ornithologists of the next generations track the continuing changes to Maine's bird life. Now, I think, unless Scott has a last word, we're ready to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Barbara and Scott. Scott, did you have a last word before we jump into the questions?
I did not. I'm not going to try to beat that.
No problem. We do have some questions that have come in already, and I invite others in the audience, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat box now, and I'll read them aloud to our presenters. Kit has asked, Barbara, what conservation actions can we take on behalf of Maine's birds?
Thank you so much for that question. The good news is that almost any action on behalf of the environment will be good for birds too. So for instance, in Maine this year, habitat conservation is always important, but this year there will be votes to, I hope, to refund the Land for Maine's Future program, providing funding for more habitat conservation. So tell your legislators to pass it and support your local land trust in its efforts to conserve habitat and manage habitats such as grasslands. Combating climate change and building resilience to its impacts are important for many reasons, but these actions will help birds too. There will be a big state push for implementation of Maine's climate action plan this year, and that will need citizen support. It's really important. Coastal birds will be at particular risk to sea level rise, so support the organizations and efforts that are monitoring and protecting coastal birds on our beaches. And thinking more close to your home as well as mine, think about those declining aerial insectivores and the insect apocalypse. Plant native shrubs and flowers, buy organic food, do not use insecticides in your home, garden, or lawn. And while you're at it, turn off those outside lights in summer for the sake of the night flying insects. And finally, I want to mention that citizen science will continue to be vital in tracking what is happening with bird species. If you're a regular birder, submit your data to eBird. But you can go deeper as a citizen scientist. Monitor a heron colony through IF&W, adopt a block for Maine Bird Atlas, or a survey route for their new night bird monitoring effort. So those are just some ideas.
Thank you so much. Kit also asks, how resilient are Maine's birds to climate change?
Well, of course, the answer to that is it depends on the bird. We need to think about where they live how specialized their habitat and food needs are, and all the different kinds of impacts from climate change. Warmer winters, probably not a problem, unless eventually it means the spruce fir as a habitat type is replaced even in northern Maine by hardwood forest, in which case many boreal birds will probably no longer breed in Maine, except in mountains and on the coast, down east coast, especially where Scott mentioned that coastal current that keeps that coast cool and foggy. More rain falling in huge dumps, causing occasional floods, as well as in between prolonged droughts, would be an added stress for wetland birds, but hopefully not a sustained stress. If their population is large enough, they may be able to withstand a bad year or two and come back in normal, quote unquote, normal years. But sea level rise is a big problem. I don't think salt marsh sparrows are going to be able to nest successfully when the sea has risen by a couple of feet, as it's predicted to do in the near future. So I would say I'm not sure that they are resilient. Another key factor is how many other stressors are they experiencing? The combined impacts of rapid warming and ocean acidification are certainly going to lead to major changes in what species survive in the Gulf of Maine. A group of experts asked to rate the climate vulnerability of birds in Maine were split on whether they thought eiders were very vulnerable or not that vulnerable. And it turned out that their split had everything to do with whether they believed that mussels were going to disappear because of ocean acidification. Those who believed that thought eiders aren't going to be able to find anything else to eat, and so eiders will decline. But not everybody agreed with that, either about whether the mussels would disappear or whether the eiders wouldn't be able to find something else to eat. So those are the things to think about in trying to think about whether birds are resilient. It depends.
And I just to pick up on that, I mean, it really comes down to the ecology of each individual species. I mean, one of the birds that I think folks are most worried about because of warming winters are Canada jays. I mean, as many of you probably know, Canada jays cache meat through the winter, and they start to breed quite early in the season. They depend on those meat caches in order to feed their chicks when there's really not much else available. And when you get really warm winters with long above freezing spells, those meat caches start to spoil. And so the number of days during the winter above freezing in Canada jay territories determines whether or not they're going to be able to survive. So, we're having a very mild winter this year, and it's nice not to shovel a lot of snow, but if you're a Canada jay in northern Maine, it may prove to be a real problem. So as Barbara said, it really depends on each individual species. Another issue with climate change, with bird migration, is that, for the most part, our springs have been getting progressively earlier across the Northern Hemisphere. For short distance migrants, for birds that are wintering, within a couple hundred to 1,000 miles, think, eastern phoebes, robins, bluebirds, things like that. They can make a determination on whether it's an early warm spring and they're going to head north a little bit early, or it's a cold late winter and I'm just going to sit here in North Carolina for an extra couple of weeks. A Blackburnian warbler in Bolivia has no idea what the spring is like in Maine. They return every year based on an internal circadian rhythm that's tied into the photoperiod and just their own internal clock. And, looking at long-term studies, places like Mohonk House in New York, where they've been keeping first arrival records back to, well, more than 100 years at this point, those long-distance migrants, those neotropical migrant songbirds, are returning on average to the day at the same time of the year that they did 100 years ago. So every year they get a little bit farther and farther and farther out of sync with the climate. And we haven't seen this happen in North America yet, but in Europe, some of their most common trans-Saharan African migrants, like pied flycatchers, once incredibly abundant in the forests of the Netherlands, their populations have dropped by more than 90% in the last 15 or 20 years because they've gotten so far out of sync with the seasons, they're no longer able to successfully raise their chicks. So it hasn't happened in North America yet because our birds don't have to travel quite as far. They're traveling to the Caribbean or Northern Central America. It's not like crossing the Mediterranean and the Sahara. but they're facing a lot of the same kind of problems. So, sorry, very long answers to that very short question.
Thank you very much, Scott. Meg mentions, or actually asks, does your book include the rock wren seen last year in a gunquit? And we had a response actually from Robert, who says that rock wren is noted on page 433. And he also mentions that it's from an account in Washington County in 2013. So when exactly was the cutoff for the data collection for the book?
Well, we stretched it in order to get that great Black Hawk in.
Exactly.
It was the end of 2018 was when we had to cut it off somewhere.
Yeah.
We had to cut it off somewhere. But here's the thing about this book. So, you know, Barbara mentioned that Peter loved Ralph Palmer's Maine Birds, but it was published in 1949. It was badly out of date. And as you have just indicated, our book is already obsolete to some extent. We recognize that. But we wrote it into the contract with Nuttall and Princeton that we have a, you know, after a certain number of years, the rights to the book revert to us. And our plan is to turn this into a living online document, you know, Birds of Maine online that can be updated on a regular basis to keep it up to date. But those of us working on this are old farts, and some young people to get involved in this and keep this going into the future. But our plan is to eventually have an online version of this that we can update on a more regular basis.
I can imagine that would be a phenomenal resource. Zach asks, could you talk about the methodology for determining the increase and decrease in certain bird populations?
Sure. So we're talking primarily about two data sets that we were using here, and I was not the one doing the statistical analysis on this. It was Charles Duncan, and I wish Charles were here to talk to the math. But basically using breeding bird survey data, which if you're not familiar with it, the breeding bird survey has been going on since 1966. It's run by the U.S. Geological Survey. There are pre-established, regularly run routes every spring since 1966. People go back generally to the same route. They're trained observers. They're stopping at preset intervals along these. It's a roadside survey basically, and they're listening and counting for singing and vocalizing birds. It's not perfect. Not every bird sings. Not every bird sings near a road. It's easier to assess the populations of you know, thicket species and open country species as opposed to, say, deep boreal bog species. But it's kind of the best. It's kind of the best snapshot that we've had over the course of time as to what our breeding bird populations are like. And then, of course, Christmas bird count data going back to 1900, and that give us a good sense of what's happening in the wintertime. So those were the two main data sets that we're using for increasing and decreasing. Now there are other aspects. I mean, Barbara may want to chime in on some of this. You know, for example, the state of Maine, as you saw from one of those charts, has been surveying bald eagle nesting territories in Maine for years, ever since bald eagles started resurging. And so, you know, in many cases for individual species, we're able to tap into those kind of surveys. Barbara, what am I forgetting there?
I think you've got it. There are lots of other questions.
Yes, and we'll go on to Gail's question about bald eagles. With the recovery of the bald eagle and its negative effect on other bird species, how will we be able to recognize when they get into balance?
We won't, because there's no such thing as the balance of nature. That's an old myth. In fact, John Kreischer, one of our instructors at Hog Island, who's written extensively, he's one of the great ecologists, says one of his evening programs at Hog Island is the myth of the balance of nature. Nature is always shifting. The balloon is bulging out in some places and shrinking in others. And I suspect that in, you know, pre-settlement or even, you know, pre-human occupation times in North America, there was a constant shift and rise and ebb. You know, in the Gulf of Maine, you know, some years particular seabird colonies were probably, you know, wiped out by eagle predation or peregrine falcon showing up, but there were lots of other seabird colonies that were successful that particular year. You know, we will see a constant flux in many of these bird populations. You know, one possibility with bald eagle predation on ospreys and great cormorant nests that's been suggested is this may be a reflection of a lack of forage fish populations in the upper water column where bald eagles can easily reach them. And as pogey, as menhaden populations come back, as alewife populations resurge because of all of the reestablishment of alewife runs in coastal streams and rivers, we may see less. We may see a little bit less pressure on eagles predating other species of birds.
James has a great question. Did the razorbill have special significance for the authors for the choice of the cover?
Barbara?
I'll speak to that. Some of you with keen eyes might have noticed that the cover of the annotated checklist of Maine birds has on its cover a razorbill. And so you can tell that that's been a bird that has been near and dear to Peter's heart for a long time. There was a suggestion by the publisher that what should be on the cover would be Atlantic puffin. And the reaction of, at this point, that suggestion came after Peter had died, but the team knew Peter well enough that they knew that he would not be happy about that because it was felt to be a little trite, honestly, because puffin had been overused. In terms of branding of all kinds of things, not always anything to do with birds, anti-smoking, or whatever else, or quick stops. So the razorbill is, I think you said that puffin, Maine is the only place in the US that it nests. I think razorbill is in that category as well. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure. So it's emblematically Maine and not somewhere else, but it's not obviously Maine. And that was pleasing to the team.
Thank you. Jim asks, what do you know about the recent use of cedar oil to rid yards of ticks? So I think this is addressing the earlier mention with, what are things we can do for conservation? What do you know about cedar oil?
I don't know anything about cedar oil.
I don't either. I'm sorry. I'll learn.
Okay. No, if anyone has some information on if cedar oil is having some adverse effects on particular bird, please go ahead and type it in so that we can have a little more insight into that. Gail asks, did the worldwide population of red-necked phalaropes, I apologize, thanks, crash as the Maine population did? So did the worldwide population crash as well?
It's interesting because it didn't actually crash. There was no evidence that the population dropped. They just went somewhere else. We just, 3 million birds picked up and went somewhere else, and we don't know where. There have been declines in the redneck phalarope population in the Eastern Canadian Arctic, along with the same regional populations in semi-palmated sandpipers and a number of other species. Because coming back to climate change, one of the things that's been happening weirdly is that it's actually getting colder in the Eastern Canadian Arctic in late winter and early spring. So it's getting dramatically hotter during the summer there, but it takes a longer time for winter to end. And so these long distance migrants that are, in the case of the phalaropes and the semi-palms that are wintering in South America, Hudsonian godwits are another one experience this problem. They get up to the Ungava Peninsula, Baffin Island, places like that, and they arrive when they're supposed to, but it's still, everything's locked up in ice and snow. They have to delay their breeding. They lay their eggs. Then it gets rapidly, really, really warm, really, really fast, so that even though their eggs haven't yet hatched, the insects on which those chicks are going to depend emerge early, and the insect peak is gone before the chicks really need them. So the birds are kind of caught in this climate whiplash effect. But there hasn't been a massive drop in redneck phalarope populations that mirrors that departure from the Bay of Fundy and Passamaquoddy Bay. They went somewhere else, and we just don't know where it is.
Sarah asks, we have crows and barred owls on our property. How can we best support both populations? Got to support the crow population.
Well, I mean, it's just they're kind of mutually exclusive in some respects. They're mutually antagonistic would be the way to put that. You know, the crows find the barred owl during the day and they raise cane, and if the barred owl finds the crows at night, that has a meal. They're not as prone to eating crows as great horned owls are. I don't think you really have to worry much about benefiting the crows. They can handle themselves. Barred owls are cavity nesters, and they need really large trees that have large enough cavities in them for them to squeeze into. And so putting up properly sized nest boxes with a large enough opening, and there's tons of plans on the internet for making a barred owl box, and put up a couple of boxes on your property, because cavity nesting owls like barred owls, saw-whet owls, eastern screech owls need a minimum of 5 cavities within their territory. They need a main nest site, an auxiliary nest site, a female roost, a male roost, and a place where the male can cache extra food. So putting up a few extra nest boxes around to augment whatever natural cavities you might have in your property will work well.
Thank you. I think on my property, the crows are just the hardiest birds I've ever seen of all the species. They're out in all the weather, getting into everything. Richard asks, what can I learn at Hog Island?
I think Pete gave the answer in the chat line. Check the Hog Island website to read about this summer's courses.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I hadn't gotten down that far. Pat says, with so many people using pesticides to control ticks and mosquitoes in their yards, what are the direct and potentially unintended secondary impacts to birds?
Barbara, you want to take that one?
I think that's a fascinating question. My first question back is, what are the chemicals that are actually being used? Because that will make a big difference. But and how is it being applied, with what impacts? If it's sort of generalized, I mean, as a general rule, the less specific something is, the more danger that it will have many secondary impacts to birds and mammals and lots of other things. I have friends whose way of controlling ticks around their house is to save up toilet paper tubes, cardboard tubes, and get some permethrin, which is not a long-lasting toxin that can be kind of go up the food chain, and soak balls of cotton in the permethrin and put it in the tubes and scatter them around the edge of their yard. And what happens is that the mice go into the tubes. They love tubes. They love cotton balls. And the permethrin probably kills the ticks on the mice, and then they don't have any ticks in their yard. That sounds to me like an exceptionally benign way of treating one's yard, as opposed to coming in with a sprayer and a nozzle and spraying all your entire, the shrubs all around the edge of your yard, and then you don't know what you're getting. It could be ticks, it could be a whole lot else besides that lots of birds eat. That would be a problem.
Absolutely. I've heard other people have had a lot of success with those tick tubes as well. And I know that they're available. You can make them yourself, or you can buy versions of them. Anne asks, what seabird protection is happening on Outer Green Island?
Scott, do you happen to know that?
I don't actually. I am not up on what's going on Outer Green, unfortunately.
I could look it up in the book, but I'm not going to take the time to do that right now.
For the
I'm
most
pretty
part,
sure I would get a hint as to what species are there and who the owner manager is of Outer Green Island, but I don't remember.
Susan says Project Puffin is managing Outer Green. I mean, almost all of the managed seabird islands, either the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Audubon Seabird Institute through Project Puffin is, has people on those islands during the breeding season to keep gulls and other predatory birds off, bald eagles. That human presence is absolutely necessary. Susan says common terns, huge colony, black guillemots. I haven't been out to Outer Green myself, so I'm not speaking from personal experience there.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. Meg asks, are there any birds that feed on green crabs in enough numbers to decrease that population?
If so, we would have noticed, I think. Because I honestly don't know. I have no idea if there are birds that would do that. Green crab shells are pretty tough. They're hard to crack through. So I'm not sure. I'm trying to picture what bird would have the bill that would enable them to do that.
I've
That would
seen,
also-
I've seen both
Yeah, go
great
ahead.
blue herons and black-crowned night herons take small green crabs. But I think the important part of that question was in numbers, in sufficient numbers to make a difference.
Exactly.
And that's the problem with invasive species, is they become invasive because there's nothing there in sufficient numbers to keep them in check, either predators or parasites or pathogens. You know, they get that, you know, they escape from that kind of control. So.
And great blue herons and black-crowned night herons are in decline as well. So there you go.
I see James Lee notes that they've seen eiders eating small green crabs with gusto, which is good because that may counterbalance the whole mussel thing.
Exactly.
And I've recently read that restaurants in Maine are trying to get creative with more green crabs. So once we can all eat in restaurants again, keep your eyes on the menu.
What are these restaurants that you're talking about?
It was in Down East Magazine. There was a whole article.
No, I just mean the concept of restaurants.
Oh, I know. It's so foreign. I can't even remember. There's a very sweet question that I think we'll end on. And this one is from Jane. And she says that she has a question from a budding birder, her grandson, who would love to know if Peter had any favorite birds.
Well, besides the razorbill, Peter, when he was just getting into birds, we had a very exciting trip up to the Gaspé Peninsula where it is possible to take a boat out to an island where there is a huge northern gannet colony. This is maybe not that easy to get to for your budding birder grandson, but you can be within 10 feet of these very large seabirds. And Peter was so totally taken by their exquisite coloring of their feet, the blue lines, the soft flesh around their bills, and their behavior, that he basically turned to me and he said, "This is enough to make anybody believe in God." So that was one of his favorites. But I think he could also go just about weak at the knees when he saw and heard bluebirds, which are now in my yard all the time. So each, you know, there are a lot of different birds that had a place for him. His favorite bird song was wood thrush. And we would have arguments about which was more lovely, the wood thrush or the hermit, but Peter was convinced that it was the wood, and he was very, very sad that we were no longer hearing them around our house. And finally, I will say the other one of Peter's favorites was Sandhill Crane. And when they started nesting in Maine and we could go up to Massillonsky and hear their calls in the spring, that was one of the last things we did. And it gave him a great deal of pleasure.
Thank you. That was, again, just such a wonderful look inside this book. That I am floored at how comprehensive and beautiful it is, and I look forward to getting my hands on a copy. I wanted to remind everybody. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Barbara.
I wanted to say something about that, getting a hold of a copy, because I know there are a lot of people who were distressed when they had heard that it had been sold out. I want to assure you that a second print run was ordered, and it's my understanding that it will be in warehouses in the United States as opposed to on a dock somewhere or in Italy where it was printed by, I hope by the end of this week, maybe next. So if you haven't had a copy yet, please talk to your local bookseller or go on the Princeton website to order it, because I'm afraid that the next printing will go pretty fast too.
I'm sure it will. I wanted to remind everybody that this recording or this program will be in its recorded form on the Camden Public Library Program's YouTube channel starting tomorrow. So if you enjoyed everything that you heard tonight and would like to share this with your friends and family, please refer them to that recording. And before I go, I want to invite Kit to say a last few words about Midcoast Audubon.
Well, actually, first to you, thank you, Julia, and to the Camden Public Library for your extraordinary support in making this program happen. And huge thank yous to Scott and Barbara. I feel as if I've taken a personally guided handheld tour of this book, which is just so comprehensive, but really, I really know how to delve into it now. And I'm very grateful for your labors of love. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you everyone who presented this evening, and thank you everyone who attended, and I hope to see you all again in the future. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.